Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 101, Iron Heroes and Nightlife. Before we launch into this week's episode, I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for their kind words concerning last week's episode. As I said when I recorded it, I wasn't sure if many of you would dig that particular topic, but the response has been excellent, and the comments I've gotten have been 99% positive. So again, thanks for your support, and hopefully we can continue to provide the kind of subject matter you want to hear about as we start the journey towards 200 episodes. And I wanted to put this up front instead of during the wrap-up of the show. You've still got time to get your choices in for the best role-playing modules ever. It also occurred to me that there's a portion of our audience out there that doesn't refer to modules as such, so let me try another term. Published adventures. Anyway, I'm almost ready to do the first episode of the 3 I'm anticipating doing, as I've poured through various lists I've researched online, so that episode covering what the writers of the hobby would put on that list will be coming out by no later than early June. The plan is to do the listener's choice episode sometime in late July or early August, so like I said, we've still got some time. By now, I'm pretty sure you know all of the socials, so you can reach out to us, but in case you don't, I'll mention them at the end of the show like I always do, and they should be in the information box from your podcast provider concerning this episode. Okay, so the announcements are out of the way. That means it's time to crank up the tour bus and get to our first topic. Iron Heroes was released in 2005. Designed by Mike Mearls, the original title of the game was intended to be Iron Lore. However, Iron Lore Entertainment threatened a lawsuit, so Malhavik Press, who released the game, requested a title change. That changed Iron Lore to Iron Heroes, and the official title of the release was Monty Cook Presents Iron Heroes. I should note that later printings of the books removed the Monty Cook Presents portion of the title. I mentioned that Malhavik Press was the original publisher of the game, and the fact that they were the publisher is the reason Monty Cook's name was originally attached to the release, as Malhavik Press was Monty Cook's company. From its release in 2005 until 2007, the title sold fairly well, and Malhavik released several supplements to their original release, and that original release was referred to as the Player's Handbook as they moved forward. They released Mastering Iron Heroes, targeted to DMs, later in 2005, the Iron Heroes Bestiary, also in 2005, and the Iron Heroes Battle Box, which was a boxed set with maps and other accessories to use in an Iron Heroes game, and that came out in 2006. But those were the only releases from Malhavik Press. No adventures, no major updates, nothing. While I should note that while Fiery Dragon Productions had released 2 adventures for the game, by the way, those were Dark Harbor and Bloodstorm, and fans of the game wrote up their own adventures and shared them on various message boards and websites, which allowed for the game to spread beyond its initial reach, the lack of further support for the game from Malhavik was noted at the time as being troublesome, and there were those who feared the game might go the way of the dodo. In March of 2007, Sue Cook announced that Adam Windsor had purchased all of the rights for Iron Heroes, and he soon hooked up with Fiery Dragon Productions to work up new materials for the setting. Adam Windsor had been involved with Iron Heroes since the beginning. In addition to all of his designer roles, he was the designer for those 2 Fiery Dragon adventures. He was also the official answer man and errata maker on the official Iron Heroes message board. So, his stewardship of the game moving forward was well received by both fans of the game and the gaming community as a whole, as it was believed the game would finally see the love it was due. I do need to add that just before the sale was finalized, Goodman Games released a couple of adventures for Iron Heroes, To Duel with Dragons and Song of the Blade. Getting back to Fiery Dragon, they released a revised edition of the original Player's Handbook on May 1st, 2007, then followed up with a new version of the Player's Compendium on July 4th, 2007. It offered 3 new classes, 21 new traits, and new feat masteries for all of the feat classes, and I'll expand on those a bit when we get into the nuts and bolts of the game. One interesting thing to note about Iron Heroes is that some of the concepts it utilized have been repeatedly noted by many in the field as being used as inspiration for some of the concepts of D&D 4th edition. So, whether you liked or disliked 4th edition, you can give a bit of the credit or the blame to Iron Heroes. There haven't been many releases over the past 15 years or so, and the reason for that is that Iron Heroes was created to be a D&D variant based on the D20 system. In other words, Malhavik utilized the open game license and system reference document from Wizards of the Coast to create, basically, their own variant of Dungeons & Dragons to release to the market. As we've noted multiple times throughout the history of this show, that wasn't a new or unusual tactic at the time, but the downside to basing a game on the 3rd edition rules and or the D20 system as laid out at the time is unless you make major changes to your rules, you really couldn't do new editions once 4th edition D&D came out because it would modify the OGL and SRD. That being said, with the 5th edition OGL and SRD being much more flexible, it's always possible we'll eventually see a new version of Iron Heroes, though I should note that fans of the game probably enjoy it just like it is, so new rules would most likely go over like a lead balloon. That being said, Adam Windsor continues to update his version of the game, checking the errata and communicating with fans of the game online frequently. So while there's no official new materials out to this point, the game has not been abandoned or discontinued. We've covered the history of the game. Now let's dig into the game itself. And I want to start with a quote from the inside cover of the game itself, written by Mike Mearls. So let's head back to 2005 for this. You are not your magic weapons and armor. You are not your spell buffs. You are not how much gold you have or how many times you've been raised from the dead. When a big bad demon snaps your sword in two, you do not cry because that was your holy avenger. You leap onto its back, climb up to its head, and punch it in the eye. Then you get a new damn sword off the next humanoid you headbutt to death. Let's take a quick look at the setting before we dig deeper because, well, you know me. I love me some setting info. Don't worry, it won't be nearly as heavy as some of the settings I've detailed in past episodes. Iron Heroes is designed to be setting independent. Yes, it provides a sample adventure setting, but it's designed only to give some detail to the overall atmosphere that would best fit an Iron Heroes game. And that adventure doesn't have a whole lot of setting detail in it. That being said, there are a few details that were provided to give the GM a starting point to build their own setting from. 1. Humanity was once enslaved by a greater race that has since disappeared. 2. Civilization is diffuse and constantly in peril from monsters and petty warlords. 3. Knowledge of the world is limited, which makes it ripe for a party to explore. That's it. The GM is strongly encouraged to build their world to play to the needs of their players, and they're encouraged to use the 3 previously mentioned ideas to build from. And yeah, I'd grant you that the second of those is pretty much true of every fantasy game I've ever played in, so it's not necessarily unique to Iron Heroes. Iron Heroes runs on the base D20 mechanic, but there are some fundamental changes made to Wizards of the Coast D20 system as created for 3rd edition D&D. First, it incorporates a number of new rules options and differently balanced classes. Next, it ditches the feat system from D20 for one of its own. And finally, it changes the way skills and feats operate in the game. So basically, Iron Heroes uses the D20 for resolution and built their own system off of it. Iron Heroes also basically dumps the idea of magic items and high-level spellcasting, so if you're a fan of those, this might not be your game, though I would strongly suggest you give it a shot. Mike Mearls has said on more than one occasion, and Adam Windsor has echoed it, that the idea was for Iron Heroes characters to basically be able to do everything their D&D counterparts could do, with the challenge being to do it without the reliance on magic items and high-level spellcasting. In other words, it's about strategy and tactics, though there are also those who've argued it also encourages the concept of min-maxing, since without magic items and high-level magic, you'd want to have a character built to best be able to handle whatever the GM could throw at them. I'd argue that while considering the magic item and spell issue thing should be a consideration when building the character, min-maxing would be more of a hindrance than a help. And that's precisely for the same reason min-maxers use to justify it. It's impossible to plan for everything the GM might throw at you. My argument then is that you need to have as well-balanced a character as possible and also try to have as well-balanced of a party as possible. Though that might just be me. Let's take a look at those feat changes. Iron Heroes was the first to employ a feat mastery system. The idea was to include what they called advanced feats that would build off of the core feat chosen. Each class is given access to different feat masteries in some shape or form. For example, the archer would have greater access to ranged combat masteries than, say, a cleric, while the berserker would have greater access to melee weapons masteries than the archer would. Over time, and as they level up and gain new feats, there are even more advanced masteries for the characters to dig into. Now, Merles didn't just toss the D20 feats out the window. The core feats from the system are included, and any character that meets the requirements can take them. One more point on feats. Characters receive feats more often in Iron Heroes than they would in the core D20 system, and several of the classes are given bonus feats, provided they're in their area of expertise. Let's take a quick moment to check out some of the skill rules for Iron Heroes. There are two major differences in how they're used in this game as opposed to the standard D20 game. The first is that there's something known as a skill challenge that can be used, and no, it's not what you're thinking. It allows the player to willingly accept a penalty on a skill roll in order to perform a non-standard or tactically meaningful action. Okay, you say, we've been doing that in my D&D game for years. Well, there's a bit more to that part. You see, in many cases, especially when the action is rather complicated, several skills may be required to be used in order to pull it off, and it's also very possible penalties will need to be taken for all of them. So yeah, that's pretty damn different. The second major difference is the use of skill groups. Now, I know we've discussed these in some way, shape, or form in a number of different games we've covered on this show, but what makes this system unique is that it wasn't a part of the base D20 system, so it is a major change. Skill groups in Iron Heroes are, as you probably figured out, groups of several skills that can be purchased at the same time for a very reduced cost. One more note on skills. No skill is forbidden or restricted to any class or by level, and they are frequently expanded or tweaked on to offer even more options to players. I am going to get to the various character types in a minute, but let's take a quick look at combat in Iron Heroes, because there's a few interesting things that make the game different from D&D. Oh, and before I get into these differences, I should note that there are only 4 of them. Otherwise, combat runs the same as it does in D&D. First, armor does not make it harder for a character to be hit. What armor does in Iron Heroes is reduce the amount of damage a character takes once they've been hit. I would argue that this change is much closer to reality than the armor rules in D&D, and it's an argument that myself and my friend Jim have been making for a very long time. Second, and maybe I should have included this in the skills section, is that skills can be used to perform heroic stunts, which would allow for the character to take advantage of things like the terrain or known weaknesses of the opponent in order to gain combat bonuses or to stick the opponent with penalties. Again, this gets a little bit closer to reality, as that's what someone would probably be doing without even thinking about it. They'd be figuring out a way to use that terrain to their advantage. And yes, I've done things like that in D&D before. However, I've had to either homebrew some sort of methodology for it or just pull it out of my ass to make it work. Third, surprise and initiative grant more advantages to all characters. That's a pretty big difference from D&D, because in that game, unless you're a rogue, you pretty much just get to act before your opponents do. And initiative just dictates when you get to go in the round in D&D. And again, this would lean a bit more into being realistic, since if you surprise somebody in a fight, you're bound to have a few more advantages on them than just getting to throw the first punch. One would think, anyway. Last, players may accept penalties to their character's combat actions to gain additional benefits. Now, I know this sounds a lot like some of the D&D feats that allow for penalties to attack for increased damage, but Iron Heroes goes way beyond that. How much beyond that? Pick up a copy of the game and check it out for yourself. I do also want to note that there are a few minor tweaks to the skills, but those, along with the 4 major changes I just pointed out, were specifically done to allow for the greatest amount of flexibility and a hell of a lot more realism than D&D, and a lot of other games, if I'm being honest. So, we've checked out pretty much everything for Iron Heroes except for the character classes, so let's get into that here. The core rulebook has 9 base classes plus an Arcanist class for those games that just have to have magic in them. I should also note that other than the Arcanist, nobody has supernatural abilities, which Mike Merles noted more than once allowed for the game to play into the low, no magic theme he was going for. The Iron Heroes Player's Compendium brought 3 more classes to the table, and one of those just happens to have some supernatural abilities. So if you're using magic in your game, you've got 2 choices. That also means we're checking out 13 characters in our deep dive, so you might want to pause the show for a moment to refill your beverage or hit the bathroom, or like me, go let your barking dogs into the house. And we're all back, right? All right, I realize I've been teasing the character classes for like 5 minutes at this point, or at least it feels like that, but I have one more small thing to do before we get to those, and that's to lay out a few things about the characters in general. So, here we go. Another one of the things that makes Iron Heroes different from D&D is the fact that different classes in the game have different attack bonuses for different types of weapons. For those who might not be aware, that's different from D&D because classes in D&D have a standard attack bonus that they apply to all weapons, then the various modifiers are figured in. Hit points in Iron Heroes are generated with a D4 with class-based bonuses used as well. As has been noted in more than one article over the years, this takes chance out of the equation when it comes to hit points and also puts characters on a more even playing field. You think I'm exaggerating? Look at the various hit dice used in D&D. Characters also have access to what's called a reserve pool of hit points that they can use to fill their hit points back up, and that pool refills every day. The downside of that is that there's no healing magic in the game. One more generic thing here is that some of the classes have access to what's called a token pool. These tokens allow the character to perform special abilities that rely on the use of tokens, and those can be gained through various actions and/or conditions. Check out the rules for more on that. And we've finally reached the character rundown for the game. We'll start with the core rules in alphabetical order, then hit the 3 from the player's companion. We'll start with the Archer, which was designed to replace D&D's Arcane Archer and Ranger classes. As you'd expect, the Archer is meant to be the ranged weapon specialist, and they get the best possible attack bonus in the game when they're using ranged weapons. Sort of a duh moment, but I figured I should point that out. The flip side of that is that their melee weapon numbers suck. Also, their hit point and skill increases would be what we term as average, so I guess it all evens out in the end. Archers get what's called an aim pool, which they fill up by spending actions to target a single enemy. Poor bastard. The tokens the archer picks up in that pool can be used to power their special abilities. Bonus feats for the class must be spent on archery feats, but that's not nearly the bummer you'd think it is, since there are a lot of those available. That means you could have an entire party of archers, and no 2 would be alike. The Armiger is next. Couldn't think of a comparable class in D&D, and that's because, other than a prestige class or a few feats, there really isn't one. The Armiger is basically the specialist in the optimum use of armor. But wait, you say, isn't armor not quite the big deal in this game as opposed to D&D? Hang on, there's more. The Armiger has armor-related feats, and those, along with their armor pool, allow for a series of armor-related abilities that bump up their defenses and help them wear out their opponents. So, yeah, this could be interesting to play. There are a few other added abilities, mostly tied to them being genuine badasses. Their hit point increases are really good, as you'd expect, but their skill access sucks. Let's talk Berserkers, shall we? They are the equivalent of D&D's Barbarian and are considered to be one of the strongest melee fighters in the game. They get their own token pool called a Fury Pool, and it can be filled up by taking damage, witnessing their allies fall, or yelling and beating on their shield. Fury tokens are used to power up and maintain various rage-styled abilities. There are some other abilities they could choose, and as you'd expect, those focus on overpowering their opponents. Berserkers have the best hit point growth in the game, but it comes at the cost of major penalties if they use armor, very few skill points, and an exceptionally crappy defense score. However, the class does have what's called natural armor, and by the time they reach level 10, it's equal to the best medium armor on the market. Of course, that's provided they make it to level 10. The Executioner is up next. I think you can figure out what he's all about, crippling and killing his opponents. One advantage the class gets that you might not have thought of is that they get an excellent progression in sneak attack. They've also got an execution pool, and that allows the Executioner to really weaken their opponents before they finish them off. They've also got the option to incapacitate them, which allows them to switch focus to others in the fight. Executioners have access to a number of melee-focused feats, plus they have feats that only work with really powerful weapons. Their hit point growth is above average, but their defense is just average. Let's take a look at the Harrier. The concept is built around the concepts of speed and finesse in combat. One major difference for the Harrier is that they don't have a token pool to draw from. This, however, is countered by bonuses to attack, damage, and defense when the character is moving. Now, there is another restriction, which is that they can't typically take a full attack action. That being said, there's a list of class abilities that make up for it. Harriers have the best progression of defensive feats and above average access to finesse traits. They've got average hit points and skills. Next up is the Hunter. The Hunter class is focused on tactical combat within the overall character group. The idea is to make use of the battlefield to aid in the coordination of allies and to confuse their enemies. The Hunter has a very interesting power in that they can transfer tokens from their own pool and put them into the pools of their compatriots, which of course allows them to keep doing their thing longer than they might have been. The abilities of the Hunter class are focused on using the terrain and on teamwork. They've got a lot of tactically oriented feats, and they get above average hit points, skills, and defense. Man-at-Arms is next. It's a bit different than the other classes, since it doesn't have any real class abilities. It's pretty similar to D&D's Fighter, since it gets a big number of bonus feats, but what makes it different is that it has access to all feat types, which allows you to build and advance the Man-at-Arms as you see fit. It also has what are called wildcard feats, which means the Man-at-Arms can swap them out daily, and that gives them the ability to prepare themselves for whatever they anticipate will come on a given day. And it's the only class that can choose its skill groups during the creation stage. Let's talk Thief, shall we? No need to mention which D&D class this equates to, so let's look at its specifics. It's considered a speedy combatant, but it doesn't have a token pool. It has access to more skill groups than any other class, can gain more skills than any other class, and has a higher cap on skill ranks than any other class. Bluff and disguise are important skills and can be augmented by the specialized personas they can create for themselves. Hit point progression is moderate, but the defensive progression is pretty nice. They also get a sneak attack, so there's that as well. Now, I kind of like the Weapon Master. I think the name speaks for itself. The Weapon Master gains tokens against individual enemies by successfully attacking them, then can spend them on special maneuvers. Now, when it comes to feats, the Weapon Master gets to choose one category of feats for specialization, plus another that they get good access to. All of that allows them to specialize in any particular weapon. That weapon gets a base attack bonus like the archers, while the other weapons in their arsenal get a lower bonus. Okay, I know I'm doing this out of alphabetical order, but since the Arcanist is the only magical class in the core book, I decided to do it last in this list. Most of the spells available use a mana pool, and that's a token pool that can only be refilled after a full night's rest. They do have access to some pretty cool and powerful magical abilities that can be used at will, so there's a decent trade-off there. So let's cover the three classes from the Player's Compendium before we move on today. The Dedicate is comparable with the Paladin from D&D in that it's a warrior with a serious sense of commitment and focus. It's the only class in the entire game with an excellent base defense bonus progression, but this is countered with a lousy hit point generation. It has excellent access to weapon-based feat mastery and good access to the defense mastery. Myrmidon is one of those classes created especially for Iron Heroes. These folks are what we'd call opportunists in that they take advantage of whatever they can find on the battlefield, and they're ruthlessly efficient as fighters. They get access to a bunch of combat abilities that are focused on either creating or taking advantage of the opportunities they find on a battlefield. They've got very flexible access to feats, which makes sense considering the class. Last up is the Spiritualist. So these guys, they make pacts with otherworldly creatures to get their magic effects. They've got a pact token pool, and there are 18 different rituals that their magic is broken down into, which is way different than the traditional schools of magic we've seen dozens of times. Okay, so we've covered Iron Heroes basically to death, and while I can look at the clock and see where we are on time, I promised you a look at Nightlife this week, so half-hour time limits be damned. Nightlife is a game with a horror theme. Designed by Bradley K. McDevitt, L. Lee Kearney, and Walter H. Majaski, it was released by Stellar Games in 1990. It received a second edition in 1991 and a third in 1992. Now, while it experienced some popularity in the early and mid-90s, it is long out of print, so if you're interested in grabbing a copy of the game, this is where I'd strongly recommend a used game bookshop or a legit online PDF shop like DriveThruRPG.com. And while it didn't have a long life, it did inspire the next generation of horror-themed games, and many of the innovations Nightlife brought to the game world were incorporated into the world of darkness, among other lines. Nightlife is set in New York City in a period of time called the near future of the 1990s. Yeah, it's a bit dated, but go back to my last statement about when it was released. Makes a hell of a lot more sense that way. Players will take on the roles of monsters, which we'll get to later, known collectively as kin. They live in secret among human society, and they, that would be human society, are known as the herd. So if you've played Vampire before, some of this isn't going to be new. That being said, let's pop the hood and see what makes Nightlife tick. Nightlife only uses D10s, and they're combined with attributes being added with skills, then the percentile system being used. In other words, take your attribute, add the skill needed, then roll the total or less. There are times when multiple dice are needed, but those are infrequent enough to not need to be mentioned here. The primary attributes for Nightlife characters are strength, dexterity, fitness, intellect, will, perception, attractiveness, and luck. To create them, you roll 4d10. Now, while most of the attributes have D&D equals, luck was a fairly new concept as an attribute, and the best comparison I have to that is the Fallout role-playing game. Luck is one of those attributes I use when I'm not sure what attribute would apply to a given situation, and it's the same way for Nightlife. Secondary attributes exist as well, and you get to those by adding together the relevant primary attributes. Survival points are the hit points of the game, and you get those by adding strength and luck, and they are depleted on a daily basis to feed the kin, and they're filled by draining herd. Humanity is something that will feel familiar to Vampire players. It's the score that basically forces the players to play kin with sympathies towards the herd. Beginning players start with humanity at 50 and can ultimately go as high as 100. Much like in Vampire, as the humanity score drops, the worse the effects of flaws get. Now, there's a wrinkle in the rules here, as you have to spend humanity to buy new edges or to raise the levels of the edges you already have. Gaining humanity requires the kin to perform humane deeds. I've mentioned edges and flaws a couple of times to this point, and while I'd love to dive into them in detail, I wasn't able to get a copy of the book to check them out. What I can say is that edges are superhuman powers, while flaws are supernatural weaknesses, such as the werewolf and their vulnerability to silver. The race of the character determines their starting edges and their racial edges. The character doesn't get access to the racial edges until later, and there are some edges that can be learned by all kin, just to note. Skill levels are generated during character creation by rolling 20d10. The pool of points that generates is split among the selected skills, and those are divided into groups: combat, unarmed combat, archaic, and general. I think 3 of the 4 need no explanation. Archaic skills do. They're those anachronistic skills that folks just don't use nowadays. Think things like charioteering or pyramid building. These would be skills that were learned by the character in their past, though I guess they could be learned in the present day, though that would be for more than a hobby than anything else. I mean, why you'd want to take pyramid building as a hobby is beyond me, but hey, I'm not here to judge. All right, so enough messing around. You want to know about the races of Nightlife, and your wish is my command. You've got your animates. These are dead or inorganic matter that has become sentient. Examples would be Frankenstein's monster, golems, or any other type of construct that could be possessed by a dead spirit. It does need to be noted that animates are pretty rare in the kin. They have vulnerability to fire and sunlight, and their mere presence provokes hostility in humans near them. Something you might find interesting is that once they've given their word, they cannot break it. They tend to be part of anti-herd factions and can only feed by draining, which means they touch humans and suck out their life force. Daemons are what you'd call your extra-dimensional creatures who've somehow found themselves trapped on Earth. They look like humans with small wigs, horns, and red skin. However, they get an edge that will let them change their shape to try to fit in. They are vulnerable to flint, holy relics, and fire, and can also be controlled with magic rituals. Typically, they're bound to the contract whomever summoned them used to bring them to the material plane, and that's typically used to compel service. Needless to say, if the contract is destroyed or the terms of the deal are completed, the daemon is free. They also drain life force by touch. Inuit are, as you might have guessed, Native American spirits and are native to North America. Needless to say, these folks don't blend in. That's because they've got a compulsion that forces them to dress in what's been referred to in more than one source as an extremely flamboyant manner. My interpretation would be more loud than anything, but you go with what works for you. They are also vulnerable to fire and are repulsed by holy relics. And like our previous two entries, they drain life force by touch. Ghosts happen to be the most common form of kin in the game. They are humans who died by violence with some important task unfulfilled. Normally, they are incorporeal and invulnerable. That being said, they can choose to manifest themselves in solid form. Their appearance, though, is a bit creepy. They appear in the clothes they died in and must make a will roll once per day if they want to change the outfit. I mean, think about it. If the ghost died during the times of the Vikings, they're gonna look like a Viking would have. And that's not gonna fit in well with 1990s clothing. Well, at least not in 99% of the places one might want to go to. They are vulnerable to cold iron, they can be permanently banished with an exorcism, and they are bound to an object that was significant to them in life, and that means they have to be very close to it for several hours each day. That also provides for another way to kill them permanently, since if the item is destroyed, so are they. It couldn't be a horror-themed game without vampires, and they're also a very common kin. So I could get into all their stuff, but all their stuff is the stuff of vampire legend, such as feeding by sucking blood, being vulnerable to sunlight, running water, garlic, yada yada, then let's move on. Werewolves are next. As is true in the legend, werewolves are humans who are infected by a werewolf, and that gives them the ability to transform into a wolf. They're rare among the kin in that they don't need to drain in order to survive, but they can drain if they need to heal themselves. Their way of draining is to inflict pain and injury on humans. And, also per the legends, they are vulnerable to silver and fire. Last up are wights. They're ugly little bastards, and there's no way they could pass as human without a hell of a lot of disguise. Their hair is white, and their skin, let's just go with dried out corpse. Not the fashion look for the season, I can assure you. They can be killed with fire, sunlight, and sulfur, and they reproduce, as it were, by infecting humans, just like vampires and werewolves. They drain by touching them and leeching their youth, which will cause the victim to age prematurely. So within the races, I think you can see a lot of the influence for the World of Darkness. That influence continues with the factions, and since all kin are divided into one, let's touch on those to end this part of the tour. The Commune. These folks believe in a peaceful coexistence with the herd. They go head-to-head with the other factions, especially those who have no issues with openly killing humans. The Commune will engage in fights with other factions publicly, but they will always try to hide the fact that the fights are between supernatural beings. The Complex. These dudes are the polar opposites of the Commune. They believe strongly that the herd is only fit to be ruled, exploited, and fed upon. They're merciless in their actions, though it should be added that they tend to be rather discreet. They're also less of a threat than the more radical factions. The Complex is all about gaining control over organized crime in New York, which, if you know your history of New York City gangs, is a tall order. The Morningstar Corporation. They're all about the conquering of humanity, and they want to do it from within. They infiltrate all aspects of human society, including politics and business, with the goal being to cause panic and chaos. The Wall Street crash of 1929? That was them. Also, the Morningstar Corporation is mostly vampires and daemons. Red Moonrise. You want a terrorist group in your game? These are your folks. They believe in the subjugation of humanity via random wholesale slaughter. They are the most dangerous faction in the game because of their ruthless nature, combined with a sadism and an unwillingness to conceal their superhuman nature. Because of Red Moonshine, Kin Society in Boulder, Colorado was wiped out by the U.S. government. In secret, of course. Red Moonrise is comprised primarily of werewolves and whites. Other than the core book, 6 supplements were released between 1990 and 1993, and these expanded on the various races, as well as providing a couple of adventures for GMs to run. And again, it's no longer in print, so if you want a copy to check out, online is probably your best bet. And if you get a copy, let me know what you think. With that, we've come to the end of today's show. Next week, we delve into another D&D setting, though this one is one I think never gets enough love despite its popularity. It's Ravenloft. In the meanwhile, check out our other fine podcast, Bad GM's Campaign Build Along. This week, we're finally getting the second act of our campaign up and running, so you won't want to miss how we're going to manage that. Bad GM's Campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your royalty-free, license-free music needs. Role-Playing History is a production of Bad GM Productions. Check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/gaming/badgmprod. On Twitter at badgmp, YouTube and Tumblr, Bad GM Productions. You can email us at badgmproductions@gmail.com, and online the website is badgmproductions.net. Next week, we dive into another horror-filled campaign setting, Ravenloft. I don't know what that says about me, but I'm pretty sure my therapist is going to have a field day with it. That's next week, though. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and your Role-Playing History.